Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Imran Chunara, Africa Muslims Agency. Right now, the world is witnessing the mass destruction of life and intense suffering caused by the ongoing fighting in Afghanistan. Innocent human beings caught in the crossfire. Thousands of families are displaced. Africa Muslims Agency teams are on the ground right now, assisting through shelter, through food, through medicine, helping the injured. Many children are left without parents. Support the Africa Muslims Agency campaign to heal Afghanistan.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and a very warm welcome from Sunday Forum, coming to you live from the studios here based at the Masjid al-Quds complex in Gatesville, Cape Town. How the world has been turned upside down. We are all living through the nightmare of the pandemic. Then the very word climate change has turned the lives of humanity upside down all over the world. The events in our country of the past 3 weeks again has turned our country upside down. And then in this week, the astonishingly dramatic events that took place in one of the poorest countries in the world, Afghanistan, has really left an indelible impression on the minds of so many people. To discuss this very important topic tonight, it is my great pleasure to have with me in the studio here in Cape Town, the editor of Muslim Views, the recipient, and I say this very proudly, of the Masjid al-Quds Lifetime Community Service Award, and somebody that I prefer to refer to very lovingly as a friend and the doyen of journalists, my dear friend. Assalamu alaikum, Farid Sayyid, and very welcome to Sunday Forum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah, and jazakallah for inviting me to share my thoughts.
Thank you very much, and thanks for being here. And then of course via Zoom we have a person whose speciality is international relations. She has served our country with distinction in the Department of International Relations, known formally as the Foreign Affairs Department. Currently she is the Deputy Executive Director of the Afro-Middle East Center. Zeenat Adam from Johannesburg, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to you.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair for having me in this conversation.
Thank you so much to you. Can I jump in immediately and ask you a question that's on the minds of millions of people all over the world? Is there any difference between the Taliban of 20 years ago and the Taliban of today?
I believe that there is, and I'm hopeful that the last 20 years the Taliban have had an opportunity to view the world differently and to prepare themselves for a future leadership role in Afghanistan. The country has been at war for more than 4 decades, if we include the Soviet Union war and we include the wars prior to that. But the last 20 years with the war on terror that the Americans have perpetrated hasn't only affected ordinary Afghans, but it has affected the world at large. And this is where we find ourselves Sunday to Sunday, and the world has completely turned upside down. I think that no one expected this, although there were mechanisms in place and planning in place that had been taking place from around 2013, when the Taliban opened an office in Qatar and expressed the willingness to engage in diplomatic talks with the Americans.
Zeenat, then you mentioned earlier on about the American invasion and the Russian invasion. I believe there were 2 other invasions throughout the history of Afghanistan, maybe for the benefit of our viewers.
Well, of course, you had the British who had occupied Afghanistan for a number of decades. So this country has been at war almost perpetually. I don't think that they've known peace in any time in our known history. But the resilience that the Afghans have is the reason why they have been known as the graveyard of empires, and just collapsing these empires across. No one has been able to withstand these simple tribal people, and no one has been able to colonize them. And I think that is the amazing resilience that we see in Afghanistan right now. But I think in the immediate spectrum, we need to really focus on what the last 20 years has entailed for Afghans and for the world under the war on terror, and what it means as we look forward to the new Taliban and a new Afghanistan, whether or not that still has an impact on them. And for me, it's really interesting that so many of the leadership that we are watching live on Al Jazeera and on other news channels engaging in the diplomatic discussions and trying to find an inclusive government for leadership in Afghanistan had been imprisoned either in Guantanamo Bay, where they were renditioned to, or in some of the black sites, including Baghram and other black sites around the region in Pakistan. For example, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, who is one of the leaders that we saw arriving in Kandahar from Doha just a couple of days ago, and in Kabul this week, engaging in those discussions that I think are so critical to whether or not we're going to see a peaceful transition.
Farid, would you say that there are international forces pulling the strings in terms of this drama that is unfolding?
Yes, before I actually address that question, and I just want to pick up from some of the points that Zeenat has made. And one, she mentioned, Zeenat mentioned Qatar, for example. So when one talks about international strings being pulled by international players, I think one must not forget the key role, be it for good or for bad, but the key role that Qatar has played. It has been home to the Taliban since I think 2013. Zeenat would know the date when the talks started taking place. And certainly, so when we look at, again, going back to your initial question to Zeenat, do we see a new Taliban? We've got Taliban Mark 1, Taliban Mark 2 now, and just on a lighter note, Starba, many have said that the transition to a new government in Afghanistan has certainly been smoother than the transition from Trump to Biden. But that's just, but it also says something. On the surface, one maybe looks at it a bit lightly, but it also shows that it raises certain questions. The speed with which Taliban was able to take over city after city. Yes, and I think it's important to state the obvious, that the Taliban are not insurgents. They're not some force that came from outside. And because they're drawn largely from the Pashtun form 45 to 50% of the population. Mm-hmm. So again, if one wants to look at the ethnic divides, the Taliban have grassroots support. They have support on the ground. The other reality that one needs to look at, the lived reality of the Afghani people. Decades of occupation. But the last 20 years, I would call it the war of terror, rather than a war on terror. It was a war of terror on the people of Afghanistan. And it has obviously shaped what the reaction would be as well. So when it comes to international players, and to address your question specifically, I think one must not discount the role that Qatar plays, but bearing in mind that Qatar is very strongly aligned to the US. We had the fissure between Qatar and the Saudis and the UAE on the one hand, but it wasn't, as if Qatar was moving away from the Western or the American hemisphere. They are still very much part, in terms of military and other relations, very much part of that same alliance. So it is significant. I think it's important to look just beyond the surface, what we are seeing now, and it's encouraging. What we hear from the Taliban, saying in terms of what they've learned, as Zeenat has quite rightly pointed out, we hope that they have looked back 20 years and looked at their failings and the issues that gave rise to certain problems. But we must also not forget that the international players haven't stopped pulling the strings.
Absolutely. Zeenat, I would then like to take up the point that Farid made a little earlier on. How much support exactly does the Taliban have among the masses of the people of Afghanistan?
Well, absolutely. Amongst the masses, the Taliban has had a lot of support throughout the years. They wouldn't have been able to move within 9 days through most of the country and then another 2 days getting to Kabul without that kind of support. We must remember that the vast majority of Afghanistan is based in rural areas and not necessarily the people that we're looking at on our screens who are scrambling to get to the airport. Those are mainly urbanized Afghans who have worked with the Americans and NATO forces, who consist of the elite in the country. So they have a very different perspective and a very different outlook. But when we look at the rural areas at grassroots level, the Taliban have enjoyed that kind of support, especially amongst the Pashto. That said, we cannot discount and forget that Afghanistan has a milieu of people, of different ethnicities, of tribes, of different languages and cultures. And that is going to be a huge challenge for the Taliban to try and bring those together and to have a cohesive country that stands as one. And I think that is going to be one of the greatest challenges as they work towards their statecraft, establishing governance structures, and what they're currently doing, and not rushing to declare government, but rather saying we want to have these discussions. We're talking to Hamid Karzai, we're talking to Abdullah, we're talking to the brother of Ashraf Ghani, who upped and left with $160 million, but his brother is still in Kabul and encouraging people to accept the leadership of the Taliban. Yesterday, they were engaging with the Hazara community, and that is extremely significant considering that there had been discrimination in the past against the Shia minority. So I think that they're really, really working hard to try and develop a cohesive government that would be representative of the vast majority of Afghans across a broad spectrum.
So, Zeenat, would you say then that in the 20 years there's been a level of political attainment to be able to be in a position to govern the country as opposed to being freedom fighters?
I think there's a few things that we need to look at. One that stands in my mind is that there are so many former detainees who are part of these negotiations, who had been in Guantanamo Bay, who had been in Bagram, etc. That experience in itself would have matured them to understanding the world from a very different perspective. And the fact that they came in and said, no vengeance and amnesty for all, is one of the most beautiful things that I could witness. And I really am hopeful that they keep up to those promises. The second thing that I would say is, when looking at the kind of maturity that has built over time, spending 7 to 8 years in Qatar, recognizing that there are different ways of doing things and negotiating. And I must add that I represented South Africa in Qatar for a number of years. So I had the opportunity of being able to see the Qatari mediation at work, particularly when it came to the situation in Darfur, and also a little bit when it came to Afghanistan as they began. And in fact, I was there last year on the day that they were signing this agreement. Unfortunately, not being a government official, I wasn't able to enter the space where that happened, but I was present in Qatar at the time. And I think that experience has also rendered to the maturity of the Afghans in understanding how to network and how to work a little bit differently, and perhaps even look at what a future government would be. But I think in this 20 years, the world has completely transformed. Mm-hmm. And when we look at the kind of technology that we have, when we look at the way in which young Afghans have been exposed to the rest of the world compared to when the Taliban was previously in power, it is a very, very different spectrum that the Taliban is going to be entering into.
So when you speak about that very different setup that we are witnessing at the moment, then it takes me to the other burning issue, the other burning question, and that is the question of women's rights and especially children's rights. What would your response be to that?
Well, to begin with, I think that we cannot ignore the fact that the issue of feminism and women's rights was co-opted and used for the purpose of invading Afghanistan in addition to the war on terror. It was the white savior feminists who wanted to come in, like Laura Bush and others, to save Afghan women from these backward people and to educate them and enlighten them and bring them into the 21st century. That didn't really happen. Very few Afghan women were given the opportunity for education under the American occupation. The vast majority have suffered. And if we listen to some of their stories, those who have been widowed, those who were in need of humanitarian aid, found it almost impossible to get that humanitarian aid without making up stories that they were victims of the Taliban, even if they had not been. And so automatically, if you were a victim of the Taliban, then you were one of the good guys, and so you would be given aid. And if you were not, and you didn't have a story to support you, you were left at the wayside. And we must recognize that humanitarian aid worldwide, but very specifically in Afghanistan, has not been helpful to the people, and especially the women and children. We're looking at a 72% of the population living below the poverty line, making them dependent on handouts, not being able to understand them culturally. And this has gone on even now with the evacuation. I just saw a video on TRT World where some of these people have been evacuated to an American base. It's not specific where that American base is, and it did not look like Al Udeid base in Qatar to me. But they've been handed out pork rations as food for today. That already tells you that there has been insensitivity of the cultural norms of a country like Afghanistan. It's humiliating, and that humiliation has been there for the women and the children of Afghanistan as well. I am not going to say that there aren't reasons for women in Afghanistan to be concerned about what Sharia law would mean for them. And previously under the Taliban, it was very repressive for women. They were not able to be seen in public without the burqa. There were attacks on them. And because it's a very tribal and warlord society, even within those rural areas that may not have been under direct control of the Taliban, there was strong patriarchy. So there is concern, but there are prominent women in Afghanistan who are willing to sit at the table and have these discussions and be part of the solution going forward. And if what we heard from the spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid just a couple of days ago at a very professional press conference, that women will be included and women will be part of governance structures, women will be able to work. If that is the case, and that there is a better understanding of women's place in society, even with Sharia law, then I think we'll be looking at a better situation for the women of Afghanistan. But if they're excluded, I think that the Taliban is going to have a very, very strong resistance from the women of Afghanistan, because they have changed in these 20 years as well, and they have a different view of what their role should be.
Thank you so much, Farid. I want to hone in on another aspect of our discussion today. The war, it seems, is over, okay? What about the financial war? Because I believe that the Americans have frozen quite a bit of assets of Afghanistan, and the economy is not in the best condition.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, it's interesting to look at one of the, and maybe, an aspect that hasn't really emerged in the discussions and analysis that we have seen, is the huge narcotics trade. Now, the Americans, including Taliban in the previous rule, and the warlords, they control the poppy fields. So it's estimated, in fact, in the latest report, that is the UN World Report on Drug Trade, 84% of the opium, of the world's supply of opium, comes from Afghanistan. And I think one needs to be aware of that reality. It is a reality. And Mullah Yaqub, who is the son of Mullah Umar, he has said, in fact, that the financial year ending March 2020, Taliban got via taxes, and this is a Taliban person, he's saying $1.6 billion from taxes. They tax the farmers, they tax the labs that process the poppy, and then, of course, the drug traders as well. You can imagine what someone as corrupt as Ashraf Ghani and his government, what they have raked in. So the economy, unfortunately, of Afghanistan is very much dependent on the drug trade. And what the Americans did is they actually supported that. They buttressed that. Taliban in the previous rule, and this was something that, you know, one hopes for a change when they say, you know, we hope that Taliban has a different approach to women's rights, etc. But one of the things that they did do in the first rule was try to actually curtail the drug trade. And they were not very successful, because now, while they're forming a government as well, we have the various ethnic groups. We have the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, and of course the minority Hazara group. They are all, you know, they are powerful warlords. And when Taliban talks about forming a government, they have to take into account the strength of the warlords in Afghanistan.
It's a reality.
It's a reality.
It's a reality.
You know, and I'm not condoning the drug trade, and I'm not saying that it is, you know, it should be the basis of the economy. But I think the reality is that they would have to look at that income in terms of taxes that will be removed from the fiscus
to keep the economy going.
To keep the economy going. And this has really been one of the, I think, the biggest challenges financially for Afghanistan. And an organization, the OCCR, which reports on organized crime where government is involved. And it's totally independent body, independent journalists. And they've looked at how the drug trade has actually shackled the economy of Afghanistan. So I think one of the biggest challenges really for any government, and particularly Taliban, is going to be how to move away from an economy, because particularly at the subsistence level. So you find farmers, villages, they are dependent on the poppy that they grow. So how are you going to get out of that? And that is going to be a huge challenge.
Zeenat, Ashraf Ghani, to all intents and purposes, was a very corrupt ruler. You also had Hamid Karzai, who now seems to be negotiating with the Taliban. And then you have Abdullah as well. So would you say that in the long run we would be looking at a government of national unity?
To a degree, that's what we're hearing from the Taliban, that they'd like to have the inclusion of all Afghans. And I think that they have seen the strength of what Hamid Karzai could also do in bringing in some groupings within Afghanistan to the table. And I think that that is a positive development. But I also want to comment on the economy and on the opium trade. Sure. We must bear in mind that 20 years ago, when the Taliban was in power, at one stage they were able to eradicate that illegal trade for about a year. It wasn't very successful, and they went back into the opium trade purely because they were forced into it for survival during the war on terror. But also bearing in mind that the opium trade is not just heroin, and it's not just the illegal and illicit trade. This opium is also being used by pharmaceutical companies, big pharma, for the production of opioids that people have used, morphine and other drugs for painkillers. So it is a massive industry where big pharma is involved. Indians have also benefited from this. But also speaking about the freezing of the funds, the IMF and the US has frozen funds of the Central Bank of Afghanistan, and it's unlikely that they're going to release that anytime soon into the hands of the Taliban. We also are looking at the Taliban reaching out to the neighborhood and reaching out to the international community, saying that they are interested in having diplomatic relations because they understand that they are not able to build a country in isolation, and they want to develop these diplomatic relations, and they want to ensure that they get some kind of investment. Now, China was very, very strategic. Already last month, before any of these moves were made, they had a meeting with the Taliban and already expressed some level of support for the Taliban. More recently, they have criticized very greatly the American involvement, but also thinking about the fact that they share a border with Afghanistan, small as it may be, and they have interests in growing the road and belt network, which mimics the Silk Road of old. And then you have Russia that has also expressed interest in engaging with the Taliban and in accepting the Taliban in its rule. You've got Pakistan that has been a traditional partner to Afghanistan for a number of years. And more recently, although Turkey was part of NATO, it seems that there are overtures to be able to have some kind of discussion. So it would be very interesting how the international community responds. In the meanwhile, what we're seeing from the Europeans is that they have this intense fear of any migrants coming across, and the racism and the right-wing nationalism that is coming to the fore in Europe is coming out quite strongly, especially now that there's this mass evacuation of Afghans. And remember, these Afghans who are being evacuated are the Afghans who had worked with NATO. These are not Taliban, and yet there is this absolute resistance to absorb these people into European communities, and fear of a migrant crisis and wanting to build walls and block them from coming in. And that is also going to have an impact on the economy and on how Afghanistan is going to try and survive. Because without its own people, and what Zabihullah Mujahid had said the other day was, we want these people to stay because they have the skills, they were part of the governance structures previously, and we need their expertise to rebuild our country. These are very important things that we need to bear in mind.
You've mentioned Russia, you've mentioned China, you've mentioned Pakistan. Do you think the rulers of Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates and even neighboring India, these people are sleeping peacefully at the moment?
India is a very interesting case. They had worked very closely with the Americans in what they considered rebuilding of Afghanistan during the war on terror, and they benefited from mass contracts in Afghanistan. What we saw this week was the Indian embassy trying to rush out of Afghanistan in fear. They were unable to reach the airport, and they decided to call the Taliban for an escort to the airport, which the Taliban did graciously. But what I'm also seeing on the news wires coming out and emanating out of India, noting that there is a very strong Hindutva right-wing government in place. There is intense fear and fear-mongering that's taking place, a lot of apprehension about what a future Taliban government is going to be and whether that would inspire Muslims in India to react very differently. So there's a lot of fake news that's developing. There's a lot of fear-mongering, but I think ultimately India will come back to the table because it's not something that they could easily walk away from, considering how close Afghanistan is to them.
Farid, I mentioned in the introduction that this has been an astonishingly dramatic week from an Afghanistan perspective. And obviously people like yourselves, in the media. Would you say that this week has been a good week for Muslims and Islam in total?
I think it has been a challenging week. And I wouldn't say it has been a bad week, but when one says it's a good week, good in the sense that a superpower, America, was forced to leave after 20 years of unleashing terror. It wasn't a benign occupation. It wasn't an occupation where they just had their acolytes doing their deeds for them. I mean, we had wedding parties, we had civil society events and functions being bombed, and it was a succession of American presidents, Bush, Obama, and by the way, Biden was vice president at that time, and then of course with Trump as well. So to see this dramatic victory does, of course, instill a sense of goodness and pride, but I would say the challenges are huge. And one of the things that, you know, if we look at South Africa, we have huge challenges. We have a party that has dominated for the almost 3 decades. And they've, you know, the corruption that's being revealed, etc. But what has really kept us together, in a sense, is a very strong civil society.
Yes.
We've had a very strong civil society, and I'm not talking of judiciary and the other arms of government. I'm talking of civil society, those who operate outside of government. Now, generally speaking, and since you asked a general question about Muslim, I think generally speaking, Muslim countries, and for various reasons, do not have a very strong civil society movement or movements. One is because of severe repression. You know, for example, in Pakistan, you know, child labor is a huge issue, and there have been civil society organizations who have raised their voices and have done tremendous work. They've actually forced certain factories to close, but at the same time, they've been persecuted as well. I'm just using that as an example. So if you look at Afghanistan, and we all hope, you know, that Taliban 20 years later is going to be a more savvy, you know, one foot of better description, a savvy government that knows, that looks at the realities and of course respects the rights of each and every person. And we're looking at the Hazara minority, the Shia minority. They were persecuted under the first rule of Taliban. But, you know, is there a strong civil society to hold government to account? And I think this has been generally a failure in Muslim societies, in Muslim countries. And that brings us to the media as well, you know. So look at Al Jazeera, which is very professional, very slick. But, you know, when the Qatari government feels that they're going to tread on their toes, Al Jazeera does rein itself in.
Absolutely.
You know, so we don't have a very powerful, well-established Muslim, independent Muslim media as well. So I think these are the challenges. So while there is cause for celebration, I think there's greater cause for pondering over the challenges that
so one needs to be cautiously optimistic.
Absolutely.
Cautiously.
Absolutely.
Zeenat, today I read somewhere that one of the warlords, a person by the name of Masud, is a tribal leader and he has not surrendered to the Taliban. Would that be a cause for concern in terms of not getting all the different factions together? And if that be the case, then perhaps a possibility of a civil war breaking out?
Honestly, I think that the Americans were hopeful that this is what they would leave Afghanistan to, and that would be a civil war of people fighting, warlords fighting, the crime syndicates getting involved. But the person you're referring to is Ahmed Masud. He is the son of Ahmed Shah Masud, who was the leader of the Northern Alliance, and they are based in Panjshir Valley. What we saw during this week were protests and the raising of the Northern Alliance flag in Panjshir Valley. Who has also joined him is the former vice president, who is claiming to now be the president displaced from his position. He was second to Ashraf Ghani, and he is Amrullah Saleh. So he is teaming up with Ahmed Masud. But Ahmed Masud, if I'm not mistaken, yesterday indicated that he's open to peace talks with the Taliban. They're not strong enough in terms of their manpower to be able to withstand the Taliban. And so I think that there is going to be a move towards peace talks. What I also want to raise is that as we watch this unfold, what we cannot allow is that NATO and the Americans are absolved of their war crimes and of the responsibility for what they had perpetrated. We look at the American presidents from George Bush, who began all of this, saying you are with us or you're against us. And then we look at Obama, and he was almost seen as the good guy, but Obama perpetrated so many war crimes using drone attacks, targeting civilians when those were supposed to have been predator drones that would target specific individuals. And what the Americans had also done was mass data mining. Now, we may think that it was all about mineral resources, and yes, Afghanistan is very rich in their mineral resources, and people are looking to tap into that, but their data mining was quite strong, and that means that they were gathering information on every Afghan that they could find. To my knowledge, they've acquired more than 80% of the data of Afghans across the board. And what we also saw during this week when the Taliban took over was the Americans sending out messages to say, this is the method that you can purge your data so that the Taliban doesn't get a hold of it. What that data mining does is it's going to it's part of mind control. If any of you have seen what Bell Pottinger had done when it comes to the population control of how people think, how they vote, what they choose to do, how politicians behave, this is part of the structures. What I would want to question as well is the South African role in this, because we had MTN that was based and one of the biggest providers of service providers for network in Afghanistan. We don't have any clear indication of what MTN is doing currently. There were rumors a couple of years ago that they were paying the Taliban security fees. We also know that a number of South Africans had been deployed not just as part of MTN, but as mercenaries and as private military security operatives in Afghanistan. These are things that we need to hold our own country accountable for, because we have the Regulation of Foreign Military Assistance Act, and we have a subsequent act to that to regulate mercenary activities, and we have not implemented that, not in the cases of any of these South Africans who have gone to war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Mozambique, or across the board. We also heard today that a South African military aircraft was on the tarmac at Kabul, and they are assisting the Americans with the evacuation. My question is, how did this aircraft get there in the first place, and with what permission? So we have to hold our own country accountable, and we have to look at what legislation we were forced into regulating into South African national law based on the pressure that we had from the Americans during the war on terror to cast people as terrorists. What is also concerning for me going forward is that when Joe Biden made his speech this week, he indicated that the reason for their departure from Afghanistan is because there are new frontiers that the Americans have to deploy to, and he specifically mentioned Somalia and other countries in Africa for counterterrorism. That means they're bringing the fight to Africa and to our doorstep, and we need to be very wary of this, because there are war profiteers who have profited, who have profited from the war in Afghanistan, from the wars in Iraq, in Yemen, in Libya, and now they're coming much closer to home.
Zeenat, on a much lighter note, and Farid, you also, when we saw that that media conference of Joe Biden 3 days after all these events took place, did you also feel sorry for the man?
Well, you know, I think he's been under great pressure. You know, he came in on a wave. Well, you know, you couldn't certainly do worse than Donald Trump.
Sure.
You know, so there was this kind of, you know, optimism around him by the Americans.
Euphoria.
You know. Euphoria. And also Americans really felt, you know, yes, someone is going to fight the corona, the COVID epidemic, etc. But I think internationally, you know, what he has really revealed, you know, is nothing different from the past presidents.
Absolutely.
So it's very difficult to feel sorry for someone like him, because I think they, you know, as the cliche goes, you make your bed and you sleep in it, you know. And I think he really has to live with what successive administrations, and he was part of an administration, as Zeenat pointed out, the drones, you know, and the war on terror, you know, and you know, he was very much part of that.
Zeenat, would you say that any other superpower in future would think 10 times before they would venture into Afghanistan?
Absolutely. I think they've seen so many being punished, and it would take someone much braver to even consider entering that space. I hope, inshallah, we never have to see that happen again. But I think it also warns any other neo-imperialists about entering any other spaces. So if they're coming to Africa, for example, it's not going to be a walk in the park. And people are aware of what these neo-imperialists have in mind about them coming as a second scramble for Africa, trying to reap the resources and leave people poverty-stricken. I think people are not so foolish any longer to believe that these imperialists come with some kind of goodness. And if we consider Biden and his role in this, he was a senator when this war began, and he voted in favor of it. So he cannot be absolved of his role. And then he was the vice president when the drones were dropping. And now he's passing the buck and saying, well, oops, I inherited this. It was Trump's deal and I had no other choice. And somehow we had to do this. But what he has shown in this week is that he didn't have a plan at all, and that the Americans had spent all these trillions of dollars without any planning, without any mechanisms in place, and that really what it did was feed corruption of war profiteers, feed corruption of people in power in Afghanistan and the elite, and further divide the people that way. And I think they really are getting a real solid wake-up out of this.
Seenat, in conclusion, I want to first of all thank you for coming on the program, but secondly, and I'd like to believe that my friend Farid will concur with me, that you managed to explain it in such a positive way that it would take me to my final question to you today, and that is, what do you see the future of this, one of the poorest countries in the world?
It's poor because of the wars that have happened. It's not poor in terms of its resources.
Yes.
And so if we acknowledge that and we understand that, then we see the potential for what Afghanistan is capable of being. But I think that the challenges that the Taliban and a future government have are immense. The first thing that we have to recognize and acknowledge is that they have stated this is not a democracy. And so the more we try to look at this from the prism of a democracy and from the paradigm of democratic principles, we're going to fail as analysts, because we're going to be seeing it not from an Afghan perspective. They have very specifically said this is an Islamic emirate and that they will be implementing Sharia law. So we need to change our mindsets and disconnect ourselves from what we have been conditioned to believe is the only model of governance in the world. The second thing is that there are different models of Sharia-inspired governments worldwide, and they have spent time in Qatar, for example, and it is not something that is stagnant. It's fluid. For example, Qatar is going into the first time of having Shura Council elections this year. So they're also experimenting with forms of democracy that are palatable and that are complementary to Sharia. But that said, I think it's going to be very difficult. Islamophobia is a very strong tool that has been used in the last 20 years and has been impressioned into our minds. It has been imprinted into us to see the world from an Islamophobic perspective. And so when we see young people standing around in their kurta pajamas and in their champals, automatically there's this impression that, well, they're not educated enough to lead. They know nothing about governance and they're not going to be capable because they don't have a British or American accent. They weren't educated at Harvard. And so we dismiss that. But for those of us who understand that our Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had come illiterate to a people and became a leader, not just with a religion and with deen and with guidance, but he also came with governance. If we bear that in mind, we recognize that leadership is not something that you get from Harvard University or from Oxford. Leadership is grown within you, and Allah also commands what that is. So I am hopeful. I am hopeful because we want to see a successful Islamic emirate. But I do recognize that there are massive challenges ahead of them, and I do recognize that the previous Taliban 20 years ago had perpetrated some horrendous crimes, and we need to recognize that people are still hurt by that. And so there is going to be a lot of work to build a cohesive strong society in Afghanistan.
Farid, as a media observer of many years, would you concur with that?
Yes, I would, and I would also add, that I think in terms of how the Taliban, and if there is a coalition sort of government, which I think would be important,
yes.
One cannot really ignore the power of various groupings. They may not have as much power as they had in the past, for example, the Northern Alliance, for example, but I think it's going to be important that internally they must consolidate, they must work closely with people that they may not really see eye to eye with, even in terms of interpretation of the Sharia law. Mm-hmm. But I think what is most important is to guard against the foreign forces. And I say this because while, we are saying that no one is going to now, dare go into Afghanistan the way the Americans and previously the Russians and, others in the past have, they, make no mistake, it's a resource-rich country. And, those, in the West and in the East, Russia and China as well, they are looking at Afghanistan as a future, source of energy, future source of wealth. So they're not going to leave Taliban and the future government alone. And I think this is where the challenge lies, is that guard against the foreign forces and, of course, the internal agents. We saw the people who are now fleeing or scrambling to get onto the aircrafts. They worked with the occupiers, and, all of them have not left. There are the remnants who are going to try to cause instability. So we are hopeful, we are positive,
Inshallah.
But I think we also need to be cautious.
Farid Sayed and Zeenat Adam, thank you very, very much for being on Sunday Forum. You've really empowered us, myself, and I'm sure all the viewers as well. I'd like to wish you all the best. And inshallah, we hope to have Zeenat once again on the program, maybe sooner than later.
Inshallah.
Shukran.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, Farid and Zeenat.
Wa alaikum salam.
Well, that's it today for our Sunday Forum. Before I go, let me just thank our technical team, Siraj Parker, Anwar Umar Rumane, and Hafiz Bilal Mahdi. A note of appreciation to Roses for the stage decor and Nisa Gaibi for the artwork. Until we have our next program, when there is going to be another breaking event that will take place from the Sunday Forum studios, Sitar Parker, bidding you Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Imran Chunara, Africa Muslims Agency. Right now, the world is witnessing the mass destruction of life and intense suffering caused by the ongoing fighting in Afghanistan. Innocent human beings caught in the crossfire. Thousands of families are displaced. Africa Muslims Agency teams are on the ground right now, assisting through shelter, through food, through medicine, helping the injured. Many children are left without parents. Support the Africa Muslims Agency campaign to heal Afghanistan.